I'm here today with Richard West of Threshold to talk about Dividing Lines, out right now everywhere on Nuclear Blast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So now that the album is out, is there a little bit of a pressure off now that fans are able to listen to the record and you're not holding it back and you don't have it under lock and key anymore?
Yeah, it's really nice. You know, we've been waiting so long for this day. It was cool to see actually after day one, we were kind of top of the metal charts all over Europe. So that was quite a good validation that we must have done something right. But it's been such a long time in the making. You know, we made the record. I mean, we wrote it in 2020, we recorded it in 21, finally released at the end of 22. So it's nice to have it out there at last.
That's a long process. When you have that long of a process, does it make it a little bit more complicated for you? Does it give you time to overthink it and maybe try to go back and change a few things, or you don't look at it from that point of view?
No, it wasn't really that sort of process. I think we started writing in the summer of 2020, and I think we finished writing pretty much early 21, but then we couldn't go to the studio till the summer because of COVID. So I think we just had a natural gap there. Then we just recorded it slowly over the second half of the year, delivered it in January to the labels. So since then, they've had that ready to do all the pressings and everything. So no real opportunity to get overly analytic or go back and rewrite the whole thing. It was just the way it came out. You know, sometimes albums are quick, sometimes they're slow.
When you look at this album, what do you feel defines this record in comparison to its predecessors?
It's funny. I thought I'd better listen to it yesterday because it's been a long time since we actually finished it. And I was really, really pleased. You know, you get to that point where you start questioning things. Have we done the right thing? Is it going to be better than Legends? Are fans going to like it? And I started seeing all the comments yesterday on social media. And I thought, wow, people are really loving this. Let me have a listen. And I had a listen. I thought, yeah, this is good. I'm loving this. This is good. It's a bit more modern. It's a little bit darker and heavier than Legends, but not particularly. Just slightly different kind of structure and profile, maybe. But it's just got great songs on there. Really proud of them.
When I looked at the album title, Dividing Lines, it's really two words that define perhaps the world we're currently living in. Was that a little bit of the inspiration? I feel like it is, considering the lyrical content. Was the times in which the album was written defining the album itself when it comes to the title and the lyrics?
Yeah, I think that the lyrics, they're very much a product of the period that we've been going through. So you can kind of hear reflections of what's going on outside in there. But the actual title, I mean, we were struggling for a title for ages. We tried 4 or 5 different ones. None of them really sat. And then I was just editing the lyrics one day, editing the vocals. And it was one of Glyn's songs. And it just suddenly I saw these 2 words, Dividing Lines, in the lyrics. I thought, that's it. That's the album title. And there wasn't really any time to overthink it and think, oh yeah, that really defines what the world's going through. It just felt right. And so we went with our gut, and it was a perfect title, I think.
How much did this pandemic impact not just the making of this album and the content on the album, but impact you as a musician?
It's a two-edged sword, you know. More time at home has meant more time to write, which is great. When you got less distractions, less stuff you can actually go out and do. But at the same time, as a musician, we were in the middle of touring at the time when it all hit. We were just about to go to Australia for our first ever tour down there. So devastating to cancel that tour and cancel a bunch of European shows as well. And then really in 2 years, maybe 3 years, we didn't really do any shows. So it's a huge difference. It's nice to have time off occasionally, but not that much, and not for that reason.
When you look at what the pandemic offered you, outside of giving you more time to work on music, is there something that you take, something positive that you take from this pandemic that you'll incorporate in the way you make future records, and the way you look at the creative process, and or even the way you look at the band and touring in general?
I think one thing I would say is never good for the creative process is having a deadline. And I think because of the process, we had time just to breathe and let the whole thing make itself in the speed it wanted to be made. There was no panic, no rushing. And so that's always good. You know, other people love a deadline. It's the only way they get things finished. But I think for us, we love to finish things anyway, but we didn't want to feel rushed. So that probably really worked in our favor on this one.
Was there anything challenging about this record? You said that, considering you didn't have a deadline, things moved really slowly, but Was there still anything that you feel like threw a wrench at you guys?
I mean, communications were a bit harder. You know, I think we'd all got used to being locked in our homes essentially and not seeing anybody, and we probably all got a bit stir crazy and a bit introvert, I think. And so I think where we were having changes of direction, or at one point we were going to do a concept album called The Fall of the Shires, and then we changed our minds. That process was quite tricky because we couldn't all just sit in a room and have a chat. So yeah, ups and downs, but no complaints at all. All came out really well.
When you look at putting a record together, from your point of view and from the point of view of the band, do you guys look at every album as a snapshot, creative snapshot of where you currently sit? Or do you also look at the records as an opportunity to evolve, grow, try new things, and maybe even put yourselves in a little bit of an uncomfortable place so that you can get something more or something different out of what you guys can do?
I think the thing with Threshold is we know what it's going to be. We know we're prog metal in the way that we define that, and it's kind of a combination of our British prog influences and our British heavy rock metal influences with a fair old dollop of pop, to be honest. You know, we got the catchy choruses, we got the catchy melodies, and so that's always going to define how we sound. In terms of evolving, you know, we'll always keep up with the times in terms of production styles and things that are going on. So if you compare this record to our first one, Wounded Land, you know, it's chalk and cheese. We've very much changed over the years, but we're not going to do a sudden, you know, when Queen did Hot Space and suddenly went all electro disco. We're not going to do that. We know what Threshold is. You know, I think with any band, you're capable of doing a number of styles, but you kind of know what your band's for, and we know what Threshold is. So our fans don't need to worry. We're not going to suddenly go all weird.
You're not going to go metalcore or anything like that?
It's not really in us, no. I think we just love what we do, and we love the way we sound. So, you know, we're going to keep on doing this.
Yeah, it's almost like you have your boundaries, you know what the band is, the DNA of the band, and you try to be as creative as possible within those boundaries, correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And what's nice with prog metal is those boundaries are quite broad already. You know, you can do an awful lot of stuff. And then if you're doing something like a 10-minute song, where we've done a couple on this record, those boundaries get even wider because you can really explore those stranger areas in a bit more detail, because there's lots of time just to expand that palette a little bit in what you're doing. And I've got to say, as a genre to write in, it's an absolute joy. It's having that freedom just to paint however you want to paint. It's just beautiful.
This album was definitely different, like you said, because of the pandemic. Obviously, it's going to be a completely different way of putting a record together from previous albums. But when you look at your creative process, what do you take from how this album was done that you can incorporate going forward and still not change the way Threshold looks at making a full-length record?
To be honest, apart from the timescales, it was kind of done the same way anyway. We're not one of those bands that gets together in a studio and jams to write songs. We're all kind of individual composers. So I sit in this studio here and just write until I've got my song finished, and then I'll present the finished demo. And then Carl and Glyn are the same. So I don't really think we'd do much different. We just probably do it a bit quicker next time.
I have to ask you about the design of the record. I have my own take, but I want to hear your take. And I want to start off by asking you about two very specific songs, The Domino Effect and Defense Condition. How important are these two tracks in the overall design and construction of this album?
I think hugely. I think we've known for a long time that it's the two you mentioned are the two 10-minute songs, obviously. We know they're kind of the fan favorites when you get it right and do a long song that works. So you'll find on a record there, the middle track and the end track, you know, they very much define the structure of the record. It's like everything's building up to those moments. So hugely important. I think a Threshold record without 10-minute songs would be severely lacking.
And the placing and where you put it in the track listing, did that force you to look at some of the other songs differently? Like you said, to build that path to get to those two tracks?
Yeah, it was actually quite difficult. I mentioned earlier, we halfway through the process, we were going to make it a sequel to Legends called The Fall of the Shires. And at that point, the songs fell in a certain order to tell a story. I remember, I think Defense Condition was in the middle of the record then, and it was followed by Silence, which actually works really well. But for the final record, we realized that we needed to end go out on a bang, you know, and Defense Conditions got that huge ending. So that was the obvious place to put it. But it's a funny thing because you've got three different writers in the band. And although we all know what Threshold is and we write towards that sound, you can hear the distinct differences between them. And I think really getting the sequencing of the record right so that they flowed well between each of the writers was probably the hardest thing. But it's come out beautifully. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. There's always a solution, but it might take you time to get there.
When I was looking at the album and listening to it and checking out these two songs, I always felt like outside of the length, because they have the similarity when it comes to the length, but I felt like they had similarities and yet differences, which made them very unique, but at the same time, together as one almost. It was almost like part one and part two. Do you see these two tracks as a little bit of non-matching twins, if you will, outside of the length, obviously?
Not especially. I mean, they were both written towards that story concept I mentioned. But I think it's just when you sit down to write a 10-minute song, once you know it's going to be a long song, everything just breathes more. There's more space. There's more atmosphere. There's more time to just relax between sections. And so I guess they become brother and sister in that way. You know, they kind of come from that same writing style.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. And coming in from that same point of view, at least from that same starting point, maybe that's what gives it that common underlining that at least I felt that common underlining with it. When you're putting together a record that has 10 songs, 64 minutes in length, how important is the design in your point of view in order to keep the listener connected and engaged with the experience of going from first to last?
Oh, absolutely huge. It's something we think about right from the beginning. Once we got the demos and all the way through the making of the album, we're shuffling them around, trying things out, trying to get that perfect running order. Yeah, it makes a huge difference. I think if you're a Spotify playlist listener, you're not going to get that. Or if you're listening on shuffle mode. But I think any great record, not saying our records are great, but any great record, you want to be able to listen from start to finish and go on a journey, go through the highs and lows. And you got to do that right.
Yeah, my opinion is that's how you're going to get the most out of any record. And this one, from that design point of view, is no different. Is that one of the things that you guys battled the most with when it comes to finalizing the album, the track listing?
It was this time, yeah. It was, like I said, it was quite hard. And it's a funny thing. I think you listen to pop records and they always top load them, don't they? Put all the hits at the front, and the ones at the end are almost like throwaway songs. And we're just not that way inclined at all. You want that massive finale at the end. So quite often our best songs end up on the end of the record.
If you had to explain the sound on this record to somebody who hasn't heard the record yet, how would you define the sound experience?
It depends on the references, I suppose. If I'm explaining it to people who don't know the band at all, friends and family, then I'll normally say we take the progressive side of bands like Queen, Genesis, and Pink Floyd, and we combine them with the kind of the heavy riffing of bands like Testament, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and then we put on some good catchy melodies and some harmonious backing vocals, and that's what you're left with. But it depends on your references, doesn't it? But what I like is everyone says that Threshold doesn't sound like anybody else, and curiously, people have said even when it's, because we've had 3 singers over the years, and even whether it's Damien, Glyn, or Max singing, you can still tell it's a Threshold record, which is kind of cool. So there must be something we're doing that has its own fingerprint.
Oh, for sure. That is for sure. When you see this record and you see how good it is from the design point of view, from having those 2 cornerstone tracks, at what point in the scale or on the packing order of what you need in order for this record to deliver what you want, does the production come in?
At what point?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Like in the ranking, if you will, of what you determine to be one of the most important elements.
Well, half of the production's done actually by the time we finish the demos, because of the way we work. Me and Carl will sit in our studios and put together a finished sounding product. It's just it hadn't got the band on, so we're kind of playing or programming everything ourselves. So all those production ideas, whether it's kind of the effects on the vocals or it's all kind of sound design stuff underneath, that's all done before we even get the band into the studio, and then they just come in and track their parts. So productions, right from day one. That's a very important part of what we do.
You guys do all the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
When it came to the keyboard sound, what goals did you have in mind for what you wanted the keyboards to sound like or the impact that you want them to have on the overall sound experience of this record?
Well, I remember when I first joined the band about 30 years ago, and I walked into the first rehearsal and there was this huge, huge wall of sound. They were already playing this massive riff, and I just listened and I thought, how on earth am I supposed to get keyboards to even pop out, from that wall? It's like the sound is already full. But I think over the years, you find the sounds that work and you find the sounds that don't. I've, tried different synths, I've tried different organs, different piano sounds. And after a while, you build up a palette of things that will actually cut through those guitars and not get in the way. And so it's just been a slowly evolving process, I think.
Do you see the keyboards on this record having perhaps a dual role in terms of the melody that they offer, but also the impact that they have as far as some of the atmosphere of the songs, and then how the lyrics breathe a lot better with that atmosphere around it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the sounds, I've kind of shied away from organs and even pianos to some extent on this record and gone for synths and kind of floaty atmospheres, because they just build this nice kind of soundscape around the vocal without getting in the way of the heaviness of the guitar. But yeah, there's a lot of melody on the keyboards as well. I won't take all the credit. Carl does a lot of the keyboards on his demos as well, and they stay on the record and they sound brilliant. So quite often I get all the credits for these great keyboards and I'm feeling mildly guilty because Carl did half of them.
Nobody needs to know. You can take all the credit. Just
cut that bit out. But
just run with it. Just run with it. The vocals on this album felt very natural, very organic, very warm. Did you guys change anything, or did that have something to do with the time period in which the album was put together and obviously the lyrical content of the record?
I think so. Most of the lyrics and melodies have been written by me over the years. And I think when I'm writing for a singer, I tend to hear that singer's voice in my head. And I remember when Matt joined the band for the album Clone in '98, he came in and sung that, and it wasn't written for him. It was written for Damien Wilson, the previous vocalist. And you can kind of tell, we kind of worked things around in the studio, made it work a bit better. But it took me really until the next album to start hearing his voice in my head. So when you write a melody, you can actually hear how the guy's going to sing it. And it was really the same with this one, because the previous album, Legends of the Shires, was written again for Damien, and then Glyn came in and sung it. So he did an amazing job, but it wasn't written with his voice in mind. So this time it was, and it's so much easier when the singer's still there when you finish writing and come to record. So every phrase that I wrote for Glyn, I could hear his voice in my head. I knew how it was going to sound, and that makes a huge difference, I think, because you kind of shy away from the stuff that's not really going to sit right, or it's going to be too high or the wrong sort of phrasing. And then 3 of the songs on the record are written by Glyn himself, and obviously he knows how to write with his own voice, so they sound fantastic.
I got one last question for you, and piggyback off of the title of the record, Dividing Lines, and the world that we currently live in, which it feels like there are dividing lines, and there's 2 tribes, and there's people on one side and on the other. As a musician, does this world that we're currently sit in worry you from a writing point of view? Do you worry about what are you going to put on a record in terms of creating dividing lines, or is that in the back of your mind, or not even in your mind at all?
I think the world current affairs kind of play into how we write our lyrics, just like they always have. You look back at Subsurface from 2004 or Wounded Land from 1993. We've always been doing that, but it's never in terms of putting a political manifesto forward. You're not trying to say anything contentious in that way. You're not trying to choose one side or the other. It's more discussing what's going on almost in a storytelling sort of a way, trying to create poetry and art. We're not trying to create politics here. So I'm not too worried about that. Obviously, there's a lot of censorship going on now if you're on the wrong side of whatever's considered to be true. Like I say, we're not trying to force one side or the other, but I think things need to be talked about, things need to be looked at. So on the album, we talk about censorship and we talk about also, political corruption, various topics, but we don't try and do it in a heavy way. Hopefully it's still entertaining to listen to.
Yeah, I just feel like these days it's so hard to find that balance, because you never know what the other person is going to interpret something as. So from a creative point of view, it might make you second guess, but I guess that's not the case.
No, I mean, it's funny, looking back on my last album, I did a song called State of Independence, and it was actually a song about Brexit. although it was kind of dressed up as a divorce between the British Prime Minister and the German Chancellor at the time. So I kind of told a story, but I wasn't saying I was on one side or the other. I was just looking at what went wrong and, you know, wondering why it went wrong. So yeah, hopefully whether you're pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit, you're still going to appreciate the song because it hasn't tried to draw you one way or the other. It's just, you know, shining a light on the issue in a creative way, hopefully. Probably most people didn't even realize, to be honest.
I was going to say, I probably it went over everybody's head. So I don't think now you're mentioning it. So now people are going to go back and listen to the song with a completely different mindset. So it's going to change the song for a lot of people.
Could be. Oh, sorry. Try and scrub that from your memory.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. All the best to you guys and to the record. The record is out right now on Nuclear Blast, Dividing Lines Threshold. Once again, Richard, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot. Really nice to talk to you.
Take care, man. All the best.